Today we consider whether a very pervasive Cardano could actually replace governments. Ready? Let's go. This is a very old question in crypto. If the king no longer controls the coin of the land and the people, can he truly control the kingdom? And we're going to consider this not in a weird, radical, anarchic way, but in some very practical ways. We need to start with an examination and understanding of what governments actually do, and not in the, political philosopher kind of style, but actually practically what do governments do? And we're on the website of the government of the city of Miami, not because I'm trying to get anybody to overthrow Mayor Suarez's city government. In fact, we're on the website of the city of Miami because I think it's a fantastic city and I love how friendly Mayor Suarez is being towards crypto. Some of the first services they list, probably some of the first ones you thought of, were police, fire, things like medical transport, right? Ambulances. As a citizen of any kind of, governed zone, whether it's a city, county, state, province, region, nation, whatever, it's basically this understanding between you as a citizen and the government that they're going to provide certain services to you and you're going to pay taxes. So some of the first ones that people usually think about are police, fire, emergency medical, ambulances, this kind of thing, right? And for good reason. These are like, primal physical safety kinds of things. So this is a function of government. And as we go through these, we're going to ask, is a government the only entity that can provide these? So with police, fire, and ambulance, we know in fact that a government is not the only type of entity that can provide these services. There are plenty of private security personnel, firms, companies throughout the world that provide the same services as police, to varying degrees of effectiveness. Obviously, we have, very highly paid, very expensive former tier 1 special ops guys who might provide security services in conflict zones, down to whoever is the worst policeman in the world. But we have worst security guard in the world on the private side. We have private firms that provide sort of security type police services. We also have private fire departments, right? Much less common, I think, in North America, but there are private fire departments. You could contract with a company to provide you with private fire protection services. Ambulance, again, less common in North America and a lot of parts of the West, but there are private hospitals that have private ambulances throughout the world, and you can call a phone number and that private ambulance will show up and whisk you away to the private hospital while providing you with emergency medical services to keep you alive and stable on the way to the hospital. So we know that police, fire, medical transport, these sort of like very first things people think about, these could be provided by private vendors. Then we have things like utilities. So this gets a little more complicated. The city might be charging you to provide water to your domicile, to do garbage removal, provide electricity. These are 3, sewage, taking care of your sewage. These are big things that a city normally does. And it's the reason why a city does it, it's kind of a weird combination of, needing to prevent a monopoly. Obviously, if one company controlled the water coming to your house and there weren't any checks or balances, having that monopoly would allow them to charge you, unseemly amounts because they know you need the water. So preventing a monopoly is one of the reasons the city, a city or whatever local government is involved in these kinds of utilities. But there are other reasons too, it's a lot of bureaucracy. Providing water to every single house in a city is a lot of bureaucracy. And so you need a gigantic bureaucratic entity to take care of that kind of thing. So it ends up being a city. But let's face it, if we went out and built a neighborhood on raw land and we wanted to provide water for that neighborhood, we could buy water from a neighboring water system, provide it to that neighborhood, and bill the occupants of the neighborhood. Electricity is almost even easier. Now, with the focus on renewable energy, we're seeing a lot more decentralized production of electricity through things like solar and wind. And, that's very often private. Of course, there are government projects, a lot of government projects in renewable energy, but there are also a lot of private ones. So it's even easier to provide electricity on a private basis. Healthcare, we kind of touched on that already. We mentioned there are private hospitals. I've been in countries outside of North America where I was treated at hospitals in cities that had both private and public hospitals, and the private healthcare seems to work just fine. It seems to work just fine. A lot of people who are familiar only with government provided healthcare might wonder, how do you keep them from charging too much? Don't prices skyrocket? My experience is it seems to work just fine in the limited number of experiences I've had with that. Education. Governments often provide education. No secret. I think anybody in the Western world knows there is a lot of private education available. I think education can be provided on a private basis just fine. And to be clear, I'm not saying it's best, preferable, or desirable. I'm just saying it exists already. We already have this. A big one is military. National governments typically provide us with a military. And you could argue about whether or not that is to protect the citizens or to do other things. We're not going to get into those debates today, but it is a thing that you can just decide not to have a military. Costa Rica does this. Costa Rica does not have a military. They decided we're not doing it, right? They don't have a military. And it's kind of the geographic location of Costa Rica, would make that seem almost unlikely because neighbors like Nicaragua and El Salvador, over the last 50 years, have not been unfamiliar with military conflict. Even Panama was a location of invasion by the United States. So over the last 50 years, they've got neighbors on both sides who had serious military conflicts within their own borders. But Costa Rica, despite their geographic location, decided not to have a military. And if you've ever been to Costa Rica, they seem to be doing just fine. It is a delightful place by all accounts. So it's not strictly necessary that a government be the entity that provides any of these services to you. Of course, governments that do provide these services are only able to do so through the scariest word in all of crypto, the T word, taxation. Contrary to what a lot of people may think, governments actually struggle to collect owed taxes. The United States, for instance, in this article is identified as having one of the highest voluntary tax compliance rates in the world at around 81 to 84%. And this article cites Germany at 60% and Italy at 62%. But even in the US, which apparently has a very high tax compliance rate, estimates are that unreported income that people should have paid taxes on that they didn't, may exceed even $2 trillion. And people think this might be 18 to 19% of the total reportable income that is not reported. Now that we've sketched out the landscape where tax avoidance, tax evasion might be 18 or 19% in even one of the most tax compliant countries in the world, we need to think about what Pervasive Cardano might do in terms of tax avoidance, tax evasion globally. If Cardano achieves the levels of adoptions we often talk about within the Cardano ecosystem, and a very large amount of people globally have Cardano, it's going to be extremely tempting for people to transact in Cardano. And I know, Cardano has all kinds of functionality and ability to create KYC solutions and all those kinds of things. But right now, if I have a copy of Yoroi on my phone or my laptop or my desktop, and I want to send you some Cardano for some commerce we've engaged in, and you accept that Cardano, and nobody really knows who owns the accounts attached to those public addresses. Very difficult for any government to tax us on that transaction unless we report it voluntarily. So while tax non-compliance right now might be in the range of 18 to 19% of all income being unreported, what would pervasive Cardano do to that number? Does it go to 50% of income not being reported? Does it go to 70%? I mean, sure, a lot of people will still have salaries and wages and paid by an employer who is going to have to report those to the federal government anyway. So a lot of people, I mean, even in a crypto environment, their wages are going to be reported to the government. But I think it's safe to say that there would be a possibility of this 18, 19% number going much higher if everybody was using Cardano. And of course, this applies to any crypto. This is not a Cardano problem or a Cardano thing. It's just a crypto thing. You could, of course, concoct arguments that because the blockchain is transparent as to transactions, although not necessarily as to ownership of public addresses, maybe crypto won't result in a larger amount of unreported income. Of course, we can have those debates another day. But for today, let's consider that the possibility, at least, that there's greater amounts of unreported income in a pervasive Cardano environment. If this happens, if we have 50% or 70% of income unreported to taxing authorities in pretty much any government jurisdiction, North America, Europe, Asia, Africa, wherever, probably a lot of government services crumble. I mean, come on, California can't even fix potholes. And they, like the rest of the United States, have this very high tax compliance rate. And they can't even balance their books enough to fix their infrastructure. So what happens if countries see a loss of, say, an additional 30, 40, 50% more tax revenue? A lot of these services, police, fire, emergency medical, utilities, military, healthcare, education, a lot of these things could crumble. But I think there's a reason why we don't want that. And it wouldn't necessarily do what people want it to do. So a lot of people who have, let's say, very anarchic sensibilities would love for crypto to result in the toppling of governments. But what we've actually seen is that government isn't just about these functions we've laid out here. Sure, government does those things, but government is also about governance. Right? It's not just provision of services, which is what people think of themselves as a consumer of a bundle of services from governments. And that's true. They are consuming services and they are paying taxes in return. But there's also this human organizational thing that governments do. It's not just sending cops to your house and sending a fire department out. It's also the hiring of those cops, the hiring of the firefighters, the hiring of the teachers, the training of the teachers, credentialing of your healthcare workers. Is your nurse really a nurse? Have they received the proper training to be a nurse? How about the doctor? There are so many things underlying these things. And while corporations, certainly we could concoct a corporation right now to do those things, it's a gigantic amount of bureaucracy. Bureaucracy is one of the things we hate about government, but government is really sort of like the commons. That's the that absorbs all the detriment of the tragedy of the commons here, right? Like nobody wants to deal with that burden of the bureaucracy of having to do all these things that require societies to function as societies. Government absorbs those burdens, right? Nobody wants to do all that boring work with all the forms and everything. And hopefully crypto can help alleviate some of this form burden. We've talked about that on the channel before. But what we found is even when you have these anarchic episodes in human history, like in the Pacific Northwest over the last year, during COVID, you saw whole sections of large metro areas in the Pacific Northwest being taken over by anarchic actors and creating things like Chaz. Was that the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone? I don't even know what the acronym meant. Basically, a bunch of people took over a whole zone, kicked out the police, and started their own little autonomous area that was theoretically, in their minds at least, free from control by any local, state or national governments. And of course, like some of the first things they did very much resembled the government they felt like they were rebelling against. Creating borders and having sort of like the equivalent of border controls and having armed people doing security. And that's been the tendency of humans. Whenever a government is toppled, immediately whoever toppled that government comes in and replaces it with institutions that tend to look a lot like the old institutions, right? It might be a different form of government, but a cop still looks like a cop and a firefighter still looks like a firefighter. It's because a society has these certain universal needs. Fires need to be put out. Robberies need to be stopped. And governments, if the society is to function well, pretty much have to serve these needs. I mean, even if you look at a map like this is an article just about government in general. And if you look at this map, we have many, many different types of government today on the globe. But you notice there are very few places without any government at all, right? These gray areas. We've got Antarctica, a few kind of like lawless nations, typically mired in armed conflict, but everywhere else there's some form of government. So even if crypto became extremely pervasive and it was able to maintain its ethoses, its various ideals of decentralization and self-sovereignty, and it crippled the ability of current governments to collect the taxation necessary to function as a government, which theoretically possible. Even if that were to happen, probably what happens is what's always happened in human history. Someone else comes in and sets up another government that ends up looking a lot like the last one. And the form of government certainly can be much worse. I don't think anyone is arguing that it's as fun to hang out right now in North Korea as it is to hang out in like Vancouver, right? Those are probably two very different qualities of life, given the varying degrees to which you're oppressed by your government. But some kind of government is set up. There are firefighters in Pyongyang. There are firefighters in Vancouver. So with crypto, I mean, I don't think the people in crypto who have this anarchic vision that crypto topples all the governments, I don't think toppling the governments is really the right way to think about it, because what would happen is a new government would just be set up. And in a lot of cases, like people who see problems with governance globally right now, certainly there are places where, we probably wouldn't mind if, North Korea, if they had a different form of government, that'd probably be okay with everybody outside of, the people in power in North Korea. Everybody would probably be okay with that. But in a lot of places, it's not the form of government that's the problem, right? We probably don't want to replace the form of government in healthy democracies. Sure, there are perversions, there are economic interests that pervert the way in which governance is executed. And certainly it would be good for those societies to prevent that economic perversion. But the form of government itself in a healthy democracy, we don't want to replace that. We want healthy democracies to retain their position. Could crypto help to prevent some of this perversion of democratic goals in these healthy democracies? Definitely. right? Do we have like very large financial entities that probably profit too much at the expense of working people? Probably. And those are the things we should focus on. I think crypto projects of all type, but especially Cardano, should focus on preventing these economic perversions of normal democratic goals. They should prevent these mega corporations from benefiting to the detriment of the working people. And I think that's what Cardano is heavily focused on, at least at the top. The leadership of Cardano seems to be heavily focused on these kind of things. And that's a big part of why I'm involved in that project, because they're not walking around saying, hey, let's have crypto replace every government in the world. They're saying, hey, why don't we create a more level playing field to increase the level of prosperity for the people who have less economic opportunity right now. Talk to you tomorrow.